Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Mississippi Music Teachers Virtual Conference. I am so happy that you decided to view my conference presentation. My name is Julia Mortyakova. I am the chair and professor at the Mississippi University for Women Department of Music. I'm also the founder and artistic director of the Music by Women Festival, and I'm very excited to share with you my session today. It is entitled Virtuosi Women Pianists. Now, in my own creative work, I am a concert pianist, and my specialty in performance is performing works by women composers. And so, because of that, I have done a lot of research on the women composers who I perform, and actually, all of them are also concert pianists. So I've actually been researching virtuoso women pianists for quite a while, but they were all composers. And as a performer and purely a performer myself, I was interested in finding out more information about women pianists before me who were pianists, but not necessarily composers. And so this is how this presentation came about. So the pianists I'm going to be speaking about today are Amy Faye, Fannie Bloomfield-Zeisler, and Olga Samaroff. Why did I choose these particular pianists? Well, they had a lot of common themes. So, number one, they were all American pianists who were trained in Europe and who chose to study in Europe, which took a lot of courage and a lot of initiative, even to this day, but specifically at the time that they lived. They all had goals of professional performing careers from the very beginning. They never wanted to do anything else. And they all, to a certain degree, defied expectations for women at the time, not only expectations in their careers and their career choices, but also in their personal life decisions as well. So as we are going through and learning about the lives of each of these women, I'd like you to think about these three questions and how you would answer them. So, number one is what led to their professional success? Number two, what is success for a performer? And of course, there are many ways to answer that question. It could be someone who has an international performing career, someone who has recordings, someone who lives on in the memory of generations of audiences and their students, someone who's a teacher. It could be someone who leaves a lot of writings behind, memoirs, educational materials. So there could be many ways that a performer could be successful. What are some of the ways that these pianists kind of achieved success as performers? And number three, what can we learn and apply to our lives? And particularly as teachers, and particularly as teachers of young women, what can we take away from these stories and share with our students to inspire them, to encourage them, to let them know that there were strong women role models who were pianists before them, and who to a certain extent may have experienced similar things that our students are experiencing today, and that they're not alone in their experiences. And sadly, to this day, there is fewer women performing and fewer women composers, and so I think there's been a lot of progress made, but we're still not equally represented in the field of music. And so I think it is really important to share these stories and to say that what you're going through now, someone experienced literally 100 years ago, and this is the creative and entrepreneurial way that they found to achieve success. And so something to pass on to our students. So the first pianist we're going to speak about is Amy Faye. So Amy Faye lived between 1844 and 1928, and she was born in Louisiana, but her family is actually a northeastern family, and the roots are prominent roots. They actually have Harvard connections, the Fays do. And her father was a reverend, and hence the reason why they moved around a lot. So she was born in Louisiana, but they actually moved from Louisiana after she was born. And her mother was a musician, and her mother and her father, the reverend, also ran a school where they educated general subjects, but also music. And her mother taught music and did a lot of other these things for the school. And so Amy's mother was her first music and piano teacher. Now, her mother suffered from poor health, and Amy um, was one of seven kids. So her mother had a lot of children, and each childbirth kind of weakened her health. And so, because of the moves, the hard life of running the school and helping her husband and raising seven children, and her ill health, she unfortunately died when Amy was only 12 years old. And so, Amy continued her piano studies with her sisters, um, her older sister Melusina Faye, who actually always goes by Zena. And actually, Amy is Amelia. She just liked Amy and went by Amy, and that's how she became Amy. So from now on, I will refer to Melusina as Zena, and her other sister Laura. And so the family was kind of broken up after Amy's mother died, and eventually Amy ended up living with Zena, and Zena at that point um, was married and lived in Cambridge. And so Amy went to live with her. Now, the relationship between Amy and Zena is a very powerful relationship. So Zena is sort of like a mother figure to her. She's her closest confidant. She's her closest friend. She's really, I think, the most supportive and kind of the rock in her life. And so that's going to be a pattern that goes throughout Amy's career. Now, um, Amy takes lessons from teachers from the New England Conservatory and then also from Harvard. This is, of course, all private lessons. And she studies piano. And Amy is also an example of this new concept of a new girl or a new woman. And this is in direct opposition to the previous ideas of a piano girl. Now, a piano girl was a high society lady who sort of, it didn't matter if she had musical talent or not. She studied the piano as a way to enrich herself, to play at home, to play for her family. It was just something to do. Whereas a new girl and a new woman were women who actually studied piano because they liked it, because they had the talent, because they thought about having a career in it. So it was not just something that they did for fun. It was actually a serious activity. And it was the idea of a woman actually thinking about herself in a career sense. Um, and in Amy's case, she also didn't want to do things like chores. She did not believe in doing household chores. She wanted to focus on her music. And so, in order to kind of understand Amy's kind of philosophy about her role at the time, it's important to look at her strongest influence, who was her sister Zena. Um, Zena was a very strong proponent of gender equality, and she was involved in a plethora of activities to promote the rights of women. And she was kind of the creator of this idea of quote cooperative housekeeping unquote. And so cooperative housekeeping was this idea that the wives would do chores together, so as a cooperatively share chores, and then they would charge their husbands for the completion of those chores, so that way they would have some means of an income. And the reason for this idea was because Zena believed that gender equality comes from economic independence. So having a small income by charging the husbands for doing chores was a way to kind of begin to attain that independence economically. Uh, she also wrote a book about cooperative housekeeping. And Zena was also a member of the Boston Women's Education Association, the Cambridge Women's Union, the Women's Parliament, and she spoke about suffrage and the women's house. So, very, very powerful voice for women's rights. And so, of course, Amy, uh, who was very much inspired and by her sister and admired her sister and looked up to her. Of course, all these ideas resonated throughout Amy's life and how she related to her career as well. So, um, Amy, when she turns 25, she decides she wants to continue her musical study by going abroad to study in Germany. And so she was not too young when she did this. She was 25, so she was very mature. And another thing I would like to point out is that she was extremely prepared for this journey. Her sister Zena helped her secure money from family members and people who were willing to help finance this trip. Of course, musically, she was very prepared because she's been studying for so many years, including with teachers from New England and Harvard. She spoke fluent German, fluent French. So with her German teacher, she spoke German. With Franz Liszt, she spoke French. So she was not someone who kind of went to Europe and expected people to kind of relate to her. She made sure she prepared. Um, and so when she goes to Germany, she's 25. It is 1869, and she goes by herself. Um, and so this is important because at the time that Amy did this, she was one of the first women to do so. So she was kind of a pioneer in that she decided to do this and was successful in it. And the reason that she was a pioneer is because she inspired a lot of other young women to do this. And the reason she inspired them to do this is because as she went to Germany, she wrote letters home to her sister Zena to tell her about how things were going, about the musical life in Germany, about her teachers, about the society, about the concerts she attended, the artists she heard. And these letters were later published in a book, which is the book of the letters, called Musical Study in Germany. And I'll speak a little bit later about the book, but this is how we know everything about Amy's study. It's from this primary source, which is her own letters. So she goes to Germany in 1869 and she stays there until 1875, and she studies with the most renowned teachers of the time. So first she goes to study with Karl Tausig at his conservatory, and first his assistant and then him. And she enjoys studying with him. Now Karl Tausig was very harsh and very not just critical, but very, he would yell, he would talk over you while you were playing, and would say this is awful and things like that. But she really actually enjoyed studying with him. But unfortunately, he decided to stop teaching. And so after a year, she has to find someone else. And so she goes to Theodor Kulak. And Theodor Kulak was not too enthusiastic about American musicians, which is kind of a theme you hear through this presentation. A lot of people were not enthusiastic about American musicians. But when he heard Amy play, he said, quote, "You are a born artist," unquote. And so he taught her for 3 years, and she enjoyed studying with him. And he was very different from Karl Tausig. He was kind of kinder in his remarks, and um, he played with the students a lot. So it was kind of a different method of teaching. Now Amy's kind of adversity that she had to overcome is she was never very confident in her own musical ability, and she always had performance anxiety. And so, of course, Karl Tausig, who was kind of harsh to begin with, didn't really help that. Now, Theodor Kulak was more encouraging, and he even tried getting Amy to perform, but sometimes he would actually give her performance opportunity. She would turn it down because she felt that she was not prepared enough. Um, and so, um, as she continued kind of working through her own performance anxiety, and as she continued her studies, she was lucky enough to meet Franz Liszt and study with him for a summer. Now, the way that they met was very interesting. She went to a party and he was there, and he asked some students to play, and she was trying to avoid him at all costs because at that point she had not touched the piano for a whole week. And so she was in no shape, physically or mentally, to play for anyone. And this is because of her traveling and whatnot. She didn't have a piano. And so, but he actually kind of sought her out and said, no, 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 I want to hear you play. And so she had no choice, and she sat down and she played Chopin's Third Ballade, which, as you guys know, is not the easiest piece to kind of jump into after not playing for a week. But after she played it, he said, quote, bravely played. And he asked her through someone else to come and see him. And so that was kind of, he invited her to come and be in his studio. And so she spent a summer studying with him, and he was a very supportive teacher, the most supportive one out of these three. And actually, at one time, she brought him one of his ballades, and he said, quote, today you have covered yourself with glory, unquote. So that's how supportive he was. He did not teach technique with his students. He was more about um, interpretation. But he really did encourage her to perform. And there was even a story where he invited her to play at some kind of a performance. And she was very nervous because it was a new piece that she had just learned. And he sat next to her and whispered encouraging things into her ear when she was doing well to help her not be nervous. So, I thought that was just a fabulous story to show that, um, Liszt as a teacher was very supportive, inspiring, encouraging, and um, really helped Amy. And Amy was actually one of his favorite students, and he said that, and he was very complimentary of her, and he was actually very complimentary of this book, Music Study in Germany, of the letters where she described him as well. So after she studied with Liszt, um, she spent a year and a half studying with Ludwig Deppe. And when she met him and studied with him, she really fell in love with his piano teaching method and became a great advocate for him and published a book about his method in the United States. Um, and really kind of wished she had more time to study with him because she really believed that his way of introducing piano technique was the best. Um, and one interesting quote from her book, A Musical Study in Germany, is she says that from her experience, though nearly all masters can give you something, none can give you everything. And I think that also kind of shows why she sought so many teachers and why she studied so much. It was the idea that she wanted to keep growing as an artist, she keep wanting to prepare and overcome her performance anxiety, but also she wanted to keep receiving everything she could from everyone, to continue having more points of view and more ideas. And I think educationally, that's a very kind of a wonderful idea that she wasn't kind of stuck in one way of thinking. She was really trying to see everything that she could gain from everyone. Um, so back to the book, Musical Study in Germany. So she writes these letters to her sister Zina. Zina thinks that this is a great historical document of what it's like to study music in Germany. And so she actually collects some and sends them to the Atlantic magazine, and they published them in 1874. And this was kind of a test run. The response was very positive. And so after that positive response, Xena decides to publish the whole book, and the whole book of, so all the letters in one book. So these letters are published as an entire book in 1880. I have to explain that the letters are edited. It's there's not everything in the letters. So of course they took out everything that was personal, and they also took out everything that was considered improper at the time. So anything that made Amy sound like she was too confident in herself, which of course is kind of ironic since Amy was not confident in herself at all, but anything that might seem that she was too overly confident. And they took out really, Xena took out passages where it seemed like Liszt was kind of lauding her, like saying great things about her. And that's because Amy said that she really didn't want people to feel that even though Liszt really admired her, that she didn't want them to think, oh, it's because of her musical talent. She believed that Liszt admired her because he personally, thought she was a great person, not necessarily because she was a great artist, which of course is Amy's, once again, very humble impression of herself. There's many times where Liszt actually does quote that she's very, very talented. But at the time, I guess it was considered improper, and people would have kind of judged um, Amy if she left in the letters anything that would sound overly confident or pompous or kind of or too intimate, something too personal about her. And so they took all of that out. So the letters are edited, but they are an amazing historical view of really musical life in Germany at the time, because it's not just her study with her teachers, it's also the concerts, the artists she heard, how people interacted, what they did, how they traveled, how they lived. I mean, it's a wonderful source. Musical study in Germany. I highly recommend everyone reads it. Um, so, um, speaking of people reading it, a lot of young women read this book, and that's what inspired them to go and study in Germany. So Amy kind of started this movement, which by 1890s was a very big movement. So by the time some of our other pianists studied, they were already not as a rare event as Amy was at the time. So she broke a lot of boundaries for women pianists from America studying abroad. So in 1876, um, Amy moves to Cambridge, and she's already a celebrity because of this book, because everybody read this book. And this celebrity status kind of helps her career. Um, in 1878, her brother Norman, who's a businessman, asks her to come and to Chicago and live with him because he's a bachelor and he asks her to come and kind of take care of the house. Um, and so she does that. Um, and in 1878, she's also the first person ever to play complete concerto at the Worcester Music Festival. And she also performs with the Theodore Thomas Orchestra. In 1883, she starts having piano conversations. So, piano conversations was her speaking about pieces, about composers, about style of the work that she was about to play before playing it. So, this is something that, of course, a lot of pianists do today, but this is not a novel idea. Amy Faye was doing it back in 1883. And part of the reason she was doing it is because it helped her overcome her nervousness, because she kind of broke the barrier between herself and the audience by speaking to them. In 1879, she founded the Amateur Music Club, which was a club for women only, with her sister Rose Faye. And in 1884, she became a member of the Artists Concert Club, which was a club for men and women. And Fannie Bloomfield was also a member of the club. She's one of our other subjects today. In 1890, Amy's sister Rose marries Theodore Thomas. Theodore Thomas was the orchestra conductor of the Theodore Thomas Orchestra, who Amy played with. And at this point, Theodore Thomas becomes the conductor of the newly formed Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Now, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra was formed with the great help of Amy's brother, Norman, the one who she moved to Chicago to help with his house. Um, so her brother Norman helps fund the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Her sister Rose marries Theodore Thomas, the conductor, right? And so when they decided to found the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, they already thought that Theodore Thomas would be the conductor. He worked with Theodore Thomas to found this orchestra. So of course, Amy is thinking because of these connections, she would have more orchestral performance opportunities, but unfortunately, that doesn't happen. In 1890, Amy decides to join her sister Zena in New York City, so she moves there. And she starts performing her piano conversations in the public schools, and she makes money doing that. Now, one thing I would like to say at this point is that there is another book of letters of Amy Fay called More Letters of Amy Fay, and this is her American years. And these letters really show the reality of what she had to face when she came back. And it wasn't all roses. She was a single woman, she had to support herself, which was hard to do as a woman at the time. And so, she had the piano conversations, she always taught a lot of students, but um, it was hard. And sometimes she would be writing letters to her family members, her sisters, or her brother Norman, asking for some money, asking for money from the estate to help her. And she was kind of living almost month to month. And so it wasn't always an easy life, but she wanted to kind of be independent, and she was independent, successfully so. So another thing that Amy was very involved with is the Women's Philharmonic Society. Now, this was an organization founded by her sister Zena, and Zena was the first president of it. And then Amy was the president of the piano department. And then Amy became the president of the entire organization in 1903 to 1914. The Women's Philharmonic Society was an organization for women. They had an orchestra, they had women conductors, but they also had these departments underneath the big organization. So they had the piano department, they had the vocal department, they had the sightseeing department, the choral department, the sacred music department. And so all of these departments had their own meetings, boards, events, concerts. And so it was a very big responsibility, Amy being the president of the entire organization for so many years. And in one letter, Amy describes that, how busy she is. And so every night of the week, she's out doing something for one of these groups. So this department had a meeting she attended, this department had a concert she attended. Today she had to go see about getting a piano to this event for this other department. Now we had a board meeting, now we had a council meeting, now we had this event or lunch or something. And so every day she's out doing something just for the Women's Philharmonic Society. So she was very active. She was very involved in musical life at the time, particularly in the life of women in music. She was also very vocal on issues, advocating for women in music, and particularly for women in education. So she wrote a letter, for example, in 1903 to the Musical Courier magazine about MTNA, our organization, critiquing them specifically for their lack of women. So she said, I'm looking at this conference program, and everybody is a man. The board is a man, the executive board is a man, this committee is a man, most of the performers are men. So out of a whole book, there's 72 men and 8 women on the program. And the women are only encouraged to attend and pay for advertising space. And so she kind of in tongue-in-cheek says, well, you know what, maybe we can have a women's MTNA and encourage the men to pay for advertising space. So I thought that was kind of a wonderful, gutsy thing to do. She also wrote in Etude magazine, and in Etude magazine, she wrote about what it was like to teach as a woman teacher. And she said that it was difficult for several reasons. Number one, for some reason, little boys were not encouraged to study music. It was girls, so that kind of decreased the pool of students. Number two, when she would be approached by someone looking for a teacher, they would always ask her for a male teacher, even though she was a teacher herself and a well-known one. People wanted to study with a man because they thought it was more professorial to have a man teacher and not a woman. And then number three, she said, even enforcing things such as lessons that are missed. For some reason, for a man, the parents would pay the money, whereas for a woman, they they would be upset if they asked for money, or they would want to reschedule or not reschedule, and the whole thing becomes so uncomfortable that it was kind of easy for her to just kind of give into it than get into an argument with the family. And unfortunately, that was due to the gender because men didn't have these issues. So I think Amy's life was very unique. She was a pioneer for studying in Germany and for writing about it and for being so active in so many things in the United States upon her return and being so outspoken in many issues. She had several things she had to overcome in her career, her own lack of self confidence, financial instability, um, but she lived an amazing life, and I think we can all learn a lot from her. So I would really encourage anyone who's interested to read um, Musical Study in Germany, which is the letters in Europe, and then More Letters of Amy Faye, which is her letters when she came back. Our next um, pianist is Fannie Bloomfield-Zeisler. She lived between 1863 and 1927. She was actually born in Austria, but her parents moved to the United States with her whole family, when she was 3 years old. Um, and Fannie was an example of a new woman, a woman who wanted control over her life, a woman who wanted to have a career, um, and was determined to do so. So when she was 15 years old, um, her parents decided that she should go and study abroad because she was certainly very talented. And her parents actually sold their house, and they also found a sponsor. And so the combination of this money paid for her mother and grandmother and Fanny to go to Europe to study. And her idea was to go and study with Theodore Lichtenstein. That was the plan in Vienna. But Theodore Lichtenstein was kind of delayed coming back to Vienna because he was in Russia at the time, founding the St. Petersburg Conservatory with Rubinstein. And because he was delayed, she had to find someone else to study with, and she auditioned for another prominent teacher. And this other prominent teacher said, "Well, I don't think you're good enough to be a pianist," pretty much. And she was very disappointed. Um, but one thing that I think is very important to know about um, Fanny is that she always believed in her ability and talent and eventual success in music, because she believed that this is what she was meant to do. So she was not about to take what this gentleman said and just stop making music. That was not going to happen. So she decides, I'm going to enroll in the Vienna Conservatory, which is where this guy was from. He was one of the most prominent teachers there. But this is, of course, a risky move. The most prominent teacher just tells you you're not good enough, you're going to audition anyway. But she does, and guess what? She gets in. And so she gets in, but meanwhile, she has some health issues. Additionally, issues with her spine, and a doctor even tells her that you got to stop playing the piano because your spine is damaging your organs. And if you keep playing the piano, it's so bad for you, you might die. And she said, I would rather uh, die in a year and play the piano than stop playing it. Playing the piano is what I want to do. So she has to overcome all of this. But finally, Lichititsky comes back, and he doesn't have a problem with her health in piano playing. And she really admires him as a teacher and continues studying with him throughout her life. Um, and his teaching method was very individual to each student who he taught. So he had no fixed method, but he did teach the mental discipline of learning a score bar by bar. That's something he passed on to Fannie. So as the uh, as Fannie and her mother and grandmother are in Vienna, they also visit their extended family, the Zeislers, and the Zeislers have a son, Sigmund, and he and Fanny become friends, and then they start kind of a courtship. They fall in love, and they decide to get married. So Fanny marries Sigmund Zeisler in Chicago in 1885, and the Zeisler is a lawyer, a very successful lawyer, but Zeisler is also a very pivotal, plays a very pivotal role in Fanny's life because unlike many other musical unions, um, Fanny was very, very fortunate to have a husband who is extremely supportive of her career, even though he's not a musician, um, and who even puts her career above his in many cases. And he travels with her on tours. He actually um, kind of changes his law practice so he can travel with her. And he does various things to support her. And he even wrote her a biography after she died. So this marriage really kind of helps, and his support really helps Fanny in her career. So in 1885, Fanny has a Chicago debut recital. And in 1888, she already has a baby, and with this baby, she decides to go back to Europe to once again study with Lichititsky. She was kind of brave like that. And she studied and performed in Europe, and she toured Europe multiple times and was very well received. She performed with much physical expression, and she was actually one of the first musicians to play from memory. She played solo from memory. But a funny story is that even though she liked to play solo recitals from memory, when she played with orchestra, she usually used a page turner. But her husband, once again, who was always trying to help her, noticed that she really wasn't looking at the score. And so before one concert, he actually told the page turner not to come. He said, she doesn't need you. So the page turner doesn't come. She's backstage, and she said, I can't go on. Where's my page turner? And they said, he's not coming. So she goes on, and sure enough, she can play without the page turner, without the music. And she comes out, and she's very angry at her husband because she's like, I know you did this. But it turns out he was right. She didn't need it. And so from that point on, she actually stopped using page turners in concerti performances as well. But that also shows the extent of involvement her husband had in her career as well. Very intimate involvement, in something like that. So touring conditions were very interesting during these years. You hear stories of train wrecks and all kinds of crazy stuff. She traveled with a tuner, a piano tuner. This tuner also took care of her hall conditions, her refreshments, her artist needs. Amy played request recitals where audience requested pieces. She often repeated pieces that the audiences liked more than once. She advocated for women composers. She said, quote, I say again, if such things are never played, artists will not bring them forward. They will remain unknown. Yet these composers have their place and value, unquote. And then she goes on to speak about Chaminade and Amy Beach's contributions. And Amy Beach actually dedicated Ballad Opus 6 to Fannie, um, and she performed their works quite frequently on her recitals. She made several recordings on her producing piano, where she played with Virtuosity and Abandon. She performed numerous seasons with Theodore Thomas, the Theodore Thomas who is Amy Faye's brother-in-law. But unlike Amy Faye, who didn't like to do chores, Fannie really didn't mind it. It was not unusual to come home and find her trying to work on drapes or trying to clean drains or those kinds of things. She seemed to actually enjoy doing them. She had 3 children, and another funny story is that during one of the childbirths, the doctor was kind of being, haha, I bet you can't play the piano now. And she said, I bet I can. And so she didn't want to scream out in pain during labor, so she would be biting on a napkin. She would have the pain. And so she went to the piano and she played the piano with just a left-handed piece because she was holding the napkin that she was biting with her right hand, and she had several pains, but she continued playing, played all the way through, and that showed not only her composure, her technical mastery, her ability, but just her um, power to make music above anything else. So this doctor, of course, was shocked and kept telling that story to everyone. Um, she advocated for American composers, and she advocated for American musicians and American music education. She said she believed that there was no reason for Americans to go to abroad anymore to study, that they had plenty of good institutions and teachers in the United States that they could learn um, from. Um, she also, they lived a very interesting life. The Zeisler, she and her husband, they actually started having a salon at their apartment and this salon started in 1902 and continued almost until her death. And so this was like one night a week when people would come over, and this was a very diverse group of people, of course, musicians, but also authors, scientists, writers, really prominent people of the day. And people would perform, professionals would perform, students would perform. There'd be chamber music, there'd be lively discussion, there'd be like some light refreshments, something like finger sandwiches or something like that. But it was mostly an opportunity for people to kind of, mingle in that kind of intellectually stimulating environment and hear great music. So that was something that they did for many years. And just to show how involved she was musically speaking, at one point she wanted to do a concert to honor her friend Muskovsky from Europe, and she kind of organized 16 pianists to play a concert in Carnegie Hall, and these pianists included Sergei Rachmaninoff, Leopold Godowsky. And it was interesting. They had 16 pianos, and each one of them played a movement of Schumann's Carnival, amongst other things. So it was kind of a cool thing. But this was, that shows Fanny's reach and how she could gather such people. She was very dedicated to her teacher and his memory after he passed away, and she actually traveled to Vienna, and she was the main person raising money for a monument to honor him. And so she traveled to Vienna and opened the monument and gave a speech in his honor. And finally, I think the best way to describe her life is this quote from her. Quote, I play for the same reason that a drunkard drinks. I play because I must, unquote. I think I can certainly relate to that. And I thought it was fabulous. And so I'm sure a lot of you can as well. Now, in terms of Fanny's musical legacy, she was a very passionate performer. She had an international performing career. She was very influential in musical spheres. Some of the adversity she had to overcome was her health. But once again, she had a very successful life and achieved her dream. Our next pianist is Olga Samaroff. Olga Samaroff was actually born as Lucy Hickenlooper. So we'll get to how she changed her name, but that was actually her given name. Her roots are from San Antonio, Texas, and her grandmother was a musician and someone who could have had a performing career by all accounts. She had a very great start. She performed from an early age, but due to kind of expectations of the time, she got married, and she ended up being more of a teacher than a performer, even though she had a start as a performer. And then she had Amy's mother, who also played. And so at this point, not Amy, Olga's mother, who also played. So at this point, Olga has two women in her life who are strong pianists, her mother and her grandmother. And so Steinway actually hears Olga play when Olga's 8 years old and even suggests that she go and study in Europe, but her mother and grandmother decided she's too young at that point. But because they do, train her, and because she's a very talented student, they decide that she should go and study when she turns 14. One thing to understand, though, even though her grandmother really wanted Olga to study and become a musician, she kind of imparted on her this idea that, you should have a career to fall back on, but really, you should really try to get married. So that was kind of in the back of her mind. So that becomes important a little later on. And so her grandmother actually travels with her. And her grandmother believes that Paris is really kind of the center of musical activity in Europe. So they decide to go to the Paris Conservatory. And so Olga goes to Paris. She studies privately with a teacher, Montel, and then she passes the entrance exams, and she's the first woman to receive a scholarship there for piano. But she goes to her first piano lesson, and she's very disappointed because her teacher says, "Oh, Americans are not meant to be musicians. Why do you keep trying to study music?" I mean, can you imagine? You cross the ocean, you go to another country, you get into this conservatory, and this is your first lesson. And this is before, he doesn't even hear her play yet. So then she plays Schumann G minor sonata, and then the teacher's like, "Well, wait a minute, Hickenlooper, what kind of name is that? Oh, wait a minute, you have Dutch roots. Her father his family's from Holland. Well, you're not American at all. You're European." But unfortunately, Lucy never gets over that first comment because it really hurt her feelings, understandably so. And so she and her grandmother decide, after a few years of study in Europe, 3 years to be exact, that she's going to go to Berlin and see if she has better luck there. And she goes there, she studies with a couple of teachers, but has no debut because at this point, several things happen in her life. So first, she meets a Russian diplomat who kind of begins courting her. And they decide to get married. But I want to go back to that idea her grandmother told her, that if it's great to have a career if you don't have a choice, but if you can get married, do that. So Olga has several things in her mind as she's deciding to actually accept the marriage proposal. Number one, that idea from her grandmother. Number two, back in Texas, there's a horrible hurricane that destroys a lot of the area where her parents live, Galveston. And so they lose a lot of money, and no longer able to financially help her, but also struggling themselves. And so I think part of the reason she decides to accept the marriage proposal was also because of financial instability in the family and financial insecurity in the family. So kind of a different compilation of things. So she marries this diplomat, and it's an unhappy marriage because one of the things that she has to give up is her performing career. She still practices and she still plays with friends, but she's not performing. She's not studying with anyone. She had no debut in Berlin or in Paris. So she's very unhappy and also unhappy in marriage in general. And so she decides to that she wants to leave him. So she makes an excuse that she wants to go visit her family. She goes to back to the States and actually annuls the marriage. Um, and so she's only married for 3 years. But unfortunately, this husband kind of haunts her for the rest of her career, literally. So whenever she has concerts abroad in Europe, he shows up. She even has to hire security to protect the stage. So he doesn't do anything crazy. So that um, individual who she married never quite goes away. Now, back in the States, now that she's out of this marriage that didn't let her perform, Olga wants to get back onto the stage. She wants to perform. So she sets up a meeting with a concert manager, Wolfson, to talk about having a debut, having a career. And he doesn't even want to hear her play, doesn't really want to hear anything about her. He says, "Show me your European press releases." And she said, "Well, I didn't have a European debut." He says, "Well, it doesn't matter what I think of you. It matters what Europe thinks of you. If you have no European press releases, you can't have a career in the United States." And so Olga is very disheartened because she can't go back to Europe. She has no money. She has the crazy husband there, right? So what is she gonna do? So she is at the Steinway Gallery in New York, playing, trying to pick out a piano for her apartment. Very upset about this meeting with Wolfson. But as fate would have it, guess where Wolfson is? He's in the same Steinway Gallery next door. He just happened to be there, and he actually hears her play because she's picking out the piano. And once he finally hears her play, he realizes, wow, she's actually pretty good. So he says, you know what? You can have a New York debut. It's risky without having European press releases, but you can do it. So he says you need to rent Carnegie Hall, you need to hire an orchestra, and you need to publicize this event. And if it goes well, if you get good reviews, this will be a good way for you to break into the music industry. So she does this. She rents Carnegie Hall. She hires the New York Symphony Orchestra, um, and she prepares a debut in 1905. And so she plays this debut at the age of 22. And this is how the name change comes about because this Wolfson manager says, well, you can't have a debut in a career with a name like Lucy Hickenlooper. You need to change your name. And so Olga was a family name, but Samaroff, we're not really quite sure where that came from, but she wanted the name to sound Russian because at the time it was fashionable to be a Russian musician. And so she kind of thought that would give her more attention. And her manager even wanted to advertise her as a European pianist, but she didn't let him do that. Not her manager. He was not her manager, but Wolfson, who kind of helped her with this concert. He wasn't actually her manager at the time. But anyway, so she prefers this very risky debut. She's going to play two concerti with orchestra, a Liszt concerto and a Schumann concerto. This is really quite a feat because she's never really had a concerto with an orchestra before. This is her first, and she's going to be doing two of them at Carnegie Hall, and then she's going to be playing solo works, and pressure is through the roof. But she said that the reason she, did this and her family, her grandmother, her mother, really kind of pulled family funds together, pulled whatever money they could find to pay for all of this, is because she, quote, believed in a successful outcome. She said, I believe in a successful outcome. I knew I could do this. So I think one of the things that make her successful in her career is her belief in her ability to achieve the things that she wants to achieve. And so she was right. She performs this concert, and she is successful. She has good reviews, And she goes back to Wilson and she's like, okay, now you're going to manage me, right? And he says, well, at this point in the season, it's going to be really hard to get your marketing out. So I'm going to need your help with that. So you need to find $5,000 to pay for marketing costs. And you have to understand, this family just spent all of this unseemly amount of money on this debut. They have no money left. And $5,000 in 1905 was no laughing matter. So, of course, at this point, she's like, okay, I guess he's not going to manage me. But one thing that came out of her debut is she kind of started playing this private musical engagement circuit. So one thing that happened is someone attended her concert or her letter of invitation to perform at a private party. Of course, she's charging for these performances. That led to more private party performances. At one of these performances, she meets a manager whose last name is Ellis. This manager has a very exclusive list of clients, and the people who are on it are Paderewski, the Boston Symphony Orchestra is on it, so very small, very exclusive. And he liked Olga's playing, and he invited her to play chamber music. It was a concert where members of the Boston Symphony played. Somebody got sick, they asked her to play. Um, and she stepped in and did a good job. So, meanwhile, her friends at Steinway and other people found her another manager, Frank, and this manager arranged for her to go to London. She travels to London with her mother. She gives concerts there. She also gives concerts through letters of invitation for private engagements, which obviously she's been doing in New York. Her ex-husband keeps showing up, the one that made she annulled and intimidating her, but things go on. Um, so she goes back to the US and she performs with the Boston Symphony. And after she performs with the Boston Symphony, Ellis, their manager, decides that he's actually going to manage her. And at this point, her career really takes off. Um, so um, Ellis, he says there's three types of artists: the box office attraction, the legitimate artist, and the small fry. And he's like, you're the legitimate artist. You're the real thing, not a show person, but someone who is mature, serious, and can attract a serious audience. And he managed her between 1906 and 1911, and she had many, many tours, and she played in US, London, Vienna, Paris, Munich, so all throughout the United States and Europe with major orchestras performing concerti. She had a huge career. And one of the sad things was that a woman pianist was a good bargain because they charged lower fees, unfortunately. So everything was going really great. Um, and she meets the conductor Leopold Stokowski. Now, Leopold Stokowski eventually becomes a famous conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra. But when Olga met him, he was actually a church musician at a church in New York. And she actually sort of almost kind of made his career for him because she was instrumental in introducing him to people and in advocating on his behalf that he would get more prominent orchestral conducting gifts, because when she met him, he was an organist and a choral conductor. And so, because she married, she decides to break her contract with Ellis because she didn't think she could manage both her married life and her performing career. If you remember that thing, the grandmother daughter, right? That marriage and performing career, they so she breaks her contract, but she still performs. She performed on the New York Philharmonic under Mahler. She performed all 32 of Beethoven's sonatas. She was the second person ever to do so and the first woman. Unfortunately, her husband has a wandering eye. In 1923, they have a divorce. Um, but she continues with her career. She is a pioneer in recordings, one of the first to really embrace recording and make recording. And she even the studio didn't have a good instrument, so she actually and they refused to buy one, so she actually bought a Steinway for the studio so she would have something good to record on. She was one of the first faculty of the Juilliard School, and she gave much time to her students. And she also taught in Philadelphia, so she commuted between Juilliard and Philadelphia. Um, at one point, she had an accident with her hand, as in um, she I believe she fell and she tore some ligaments, but she didn't realize that, and she continued playing concerts because she had concerts. And instead of actually going to the doctor, when she finally went to the doctor said, "Well, these ligaments are torn. You have to kind of let the hand rest for a year." But she didn't let that stop her. While she was not performing, she actually became a critic for the New York Evening Post, and this proved to be a very kind of interesting, but also great career choice for her and for people who read her criticism, because she believed the role of the critic was not necessarily to pass judgment, but rather to describe. And she criticized the practice of criticism because she became really tired of reading really, uh, kind of negative reviews about performances when some of these critics didn't even really hear the pieces, didn't attend the pieces. And the reason we know that is because they would describe pieces that actually weren't performed at the program, because they would sometimes not even go. And so she thought that was very unfair to the artists, and that was very unfair to the audience members and to people reading this criticism, because it was, you know, um, they were passing judgment. They were not describing what happened, essentially. And so that's what she tried to rectify. She was also very concerned with a young artist experiencing the same obstacles that she had due to not having a European debut early on in her career. And so she started the Schubert Memorial debut concert series, and she kind of roped a lot of other prominent musicians into this endeavor. And so um, soloists would be given an opportunity to have debut recitals as well as concerto performances in the United States to sort of jumpstart their career in the US without having to go to Europe. She was also very concerned with educating audiences and making audiences more engaged through their understanding of music. And so she started this idea of layman's music courses. And these layman's music courses first started at Juilliard, but then she took them to Philadelphia, and they eventually spread throughout the United States. And it was sort of a more active idea than just music appreciation. They weren't just talking about music, they were learning to actively listen to music. So she taught them some ear training. She really taught them to be engaged and understand um, what music was about that they were listening to, so they felt like they could really relate to it more. And so she would take people who couldn't tell different pitches apart, and then she would train their ear so that by the time that they were done with these classes, they could actually listen to music and understand it and speak about it intelligently and really enjoy it more. And so these layman's music courses became a very big prominent thing. She wrote the layman's music book in 1935. She was invited to attend the International Music Conference in Prague, and she was the only performer to do so because of her layman's music courses in the States and how successful they were. She was very concerned about students and their financial situations. She had students live with her many times just to make sure that they were taken care of. She started and funded the Musicians Emergency Fund to help struggling students financially. In 1939, she wrote her biography, An American Musician's Story. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend you read it. Once again, primary source. Really, a really great glimpse of life in the United States and Europe, and just what a life of a musician was like at the time. Very honest book, um, and very fun to read. Very engaging book. In 1943, she started giving lectures on the radio, and the radio lectures kind of started like layman's, as the idea of the layman's music courses. So there was lecture, but then she would also have discussion. She would have professional musicians, and then audience members could kind of have questions. And so there'll be a dialogue that will be started between the audience members and professional musicians to kind of break that barrier on the show. She would also have musicians come play, students come play. And one of the things that she wanted to do is she was very concerned with the prejudice against women musicians, as our other two pianists were as well. And so she at one point had a listening contest where people had to guess the gender of the performer, and only one third guessed correctly. And so, for example, she had one student who was a woman, and no one thought that she was a woman. None of the people who listened guessed that she was a woman. So it just kind of shows how ridiculous gender prejudice is in music. But as a teacher, she said, quote, "I'm going to teach you so you can be rid of me," she told her students. "I'm going to make you an independent musician." And she taught them to look for significance in music. So I think she was a pioneer in many ways, in how she started her career, in the kinds of projects she took on with the recordings, with creating debut concert series, with the latest music classes, the music criticism. Some of the obstacles she had to overcome was personal struggles. So her first husband, her second divorce, and her hand injury. But she always came out from this with a creative um, musical outcome that kind of took her to another sphere in music, and once again I think made her very important in musical history. So the questions that we were talking about, what led to their professional success? Well, I think for Amy Faye, it was her constant desire and need to learn to improve herself. She never felt quite happy with her musical knowledge, and she kept wanting to have more lessons and more training. So this constant need to learn, to study, to improve oneself. Her activism, her involvement in all of these musical organizations, and her writing to prominent publications, and voicing concern about how women were treated. So she was very active. She spoke out. And she had great support of her sister Zena. And I think that's one thing about all three women. They all had somebody in their life who was their rock, who kind of helped them throughout their career. So for Fannie Bloomfield-Zeisler, um, her professional success, um, and what led to her professional success, um, was her passion for performing. She could not live without performing. And that's what made her succeed. She didn't listen to anyone when they said, "Oh, you can't perform because you were too sick," or "You can't perform because of this," or it's like, "No, I will perform." And the support of her husband, he was her encouragement. And then for Samaroff, um, her professional success came from her confidence in her ability. Um, her activism on behalf of other American students who may have struggled to have a debut, to be heard, to be known, um, and her activism on behalf of audiences, trying to educate them, her activism on behalf of artists who were criticized by critics and saying, this is not right. So she's very outspoken and active and involved in many things, and especially her teaching at all these various institutions such as Juilliard, and the support of her grandmother and her mother. They were always there for her, and throughout her life, and obviously throughout her career, but also throughout her life. So, what is success for a performer? I think in all three cases, we can agree that they lived their life on their terms, and they were doing what they set out to do, which is having a life in music and making a career with it, making money with it, at a time that was not the norm, and that was kind of unusual. But they did it, and they were very successful. And it's not that they didn't have things they had to overcome, but they persevered through them. So what can we learn and apply to our lives? Well, this idea of perseverance and not giving up, resilience, just kind of finding your way, keep going, facing, overcoming setbacks and obstacles. So financial problems for Amy Faye, health for Bloomfield-Zeisler, personal issues for Olga Samaroff. But they just kept going, and no matter what happened, they um, found a different way to be active in music, to celebrate music, to make music, to inspire others to love and make music as well. Um, and they were all creative, and they were all entrepreneurial. Um, and I think that's one thing that we can pass on to our students is what unique things can they offer to the world. So all these women had different outlets, whether it was writing, whether it was being a radio show host, having piano conversations, um, putting together your own debut, or teaching audiences how to listen to layman's music classes. These are all very creative ideas, but they were all ideas in, in sharing music, and in kind of having these women once again be in music. And so there's always a creative way to have someone be engaged in our art that maybe other people have not thought of, but it doesn't mean it will not work, and it actually will help one's career overall. And I think the most important thing as a teacher to pass on is that you should never give up fighting for your dream. If your dream is to be a musician, to be a pianist, to be a performer, there is a way to make that happen. And just because someone tells you, oh, you're too sick, you can't do this, or because someone tells you you didn't have a European debut, well, you know what? You can say, I'm going to have a debut in America. I'm going to do this on my own. I'm going to do this. So, and I guess it's also hard work. They all worked really hard and studied, and were really kind of tough on themselves. But they knew that if they did that, they would have a chance, and they didn't let obstacles stop them from achieving their dream. So, fighting for one's dream. So, this is my bibliography, and I encourage you to read some of these books and materials. Amazing information. As I said, we have some primary sources. We have for Emife musical letters for our music study in Germany. We have more letters of Emife. These are all her letters. For Olga Samaroff, we have An American Musician Story, which is her autobiography. So, highly recommend you check these out. These are their words. Also, a lot of other individuals wrote about their lives, which were incredible. So it's really inspiring to read this for me as a pianist. So I really encourage everyone to do that. Um, and if you like a copy of this bibliography, I'll be more than happy to share it with you. And you can contact me via my email um, address, and my website is www.juliamortyakova.com. My email is mortyakova@gmail.com. I would love to engage with you if you have any questions, or if you want to hear more, if you have thoughts in response to this. Um, and I'd also like to say that we have performance emphasis at the W within our music BA degree, BA music degree. So if you have students who are interested in pursuing performance, we have that emphasis. Um, and I think that sometimes people think that a career in music is um, a difficult journey, and it can be, and it's not easy. But as we learned today, um, I think it is possible to have a life in music, and it is a beautiful life. And so, um, I guess that's what I learned from getting to know the lives of these women. Um, okay, well, thank you so much for listening to my session, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference. And I hope to see you in person next year. Bye.